So one of the first things we did is create this tool that we refer to as a benefit fraud assessment program, in which we would take a statistical random sampling of what we believed, anecdotally, having worked under legacy INS for decades, the high-risk forms. So we focused initially on the religious worker category, both non-immigrant and immigrant, and we found an alarming fraud rate of 33%. And the most common type of fraud that existed that we learn years later crosses a variety of different employment-based programs is twofold. One is that the petitioner didn't even physically exist, supposed to be a place of worship or perhaps a technology firm or some other type of business, or perhaps even a residence of an alleged husband and wife, when in fact it was a vacant lot, a barbershop, a shoe store, or something that obviously wasn't what it was supposed to be. And then the second was, when you looked at the location and conduct that site visit, if you will, it appeared to look like an establishment that was reported. So the officer would go inside, identify themselves, and ask to speak to management, and ask some very basic general questions that were already provided on the petition. And what did we find? An alarming number where management was unaware of the petition, did not know the beneficiary, and in some cases conceded to fraud. So we looked at that and we decided we better start doing some more assessments. So that's when we decided, well, let's look at employment-based. Let's look at the application that permanent residents file when they reportedly lost their green cards or had them stolen. So we wanted to look at those areas because we felt they were the highest risk in a post-911 environment, where individuals could manipulate our system and engage in activities that would obviously prove to be harmful to the United States. And as subsequent to the creation of FDNS, it was validated by the 911 Commission in their report that all those terrorists engaged in some sort of immigration fraud to obtain a benefit, whether it was a visa overseas to come into the country or a visa through the application process with either legacy INS or USCIS. So we focused on other employment-based petitions and fortunately did not have that significant 33% high fraud rate. They were much lower, between the 12 and the 16-7% arena. But with regard to the applications for lost or stolen cards, we thought that we would have a very high fraud rate, which would be very alarming if individuals out there had cards showing they were permanent residents when in fact they weren't. And the typical fraud that we were experiencing under legacy INS in a pre-911 world was that permanent residents would, for a fee, allow another individual's photograph to be submitted with the application so that the agency would check its databases and see that, yes, they were a permanent resident, that they entered on this date and this was the classification, and they'd issue them a replacement card with the new photograph. Unfortunately, it wasn't the photograph of the true permanent resident, and that was the fraud that we were experiencing under legacy INS in a pre-911 world. Fortunately, what we learned was that the fraud rate was less than 1%. And in all the benefit fraud assessments that we had done, and we completed a handful of benefit fraud assessments, and up until the point I retired, there were a handful that the field work had been done, but the actual assessment itself had not been completed. There's a government process to go through to get those completed. But the primary reason the fraud rate was so low was that CIS had taken it upon itself to implement two very significant improvements. One is they required the adjudicators to look at the images, the photographs that were submitted at an earlier date, particularly at the time these people immigrated, and compare them to the photographs that were being submitted with the application to get a replacement. And that was not being done across the board prior to that time. The other thing they did is they required the applicants for the replacement cards to go to an application support center, which are biometric centers. And there, the applicants had to have their identity check done in person. So then we have the checks of the images in the databases and in the immigrant files, and the biometrics collected and background checks done before we issued the replacement card. So it goes to show you that if we focus on identifying the vulnerabilities, we're in a better position to undertake the corrective action and to reduce, if not eliminate, fraud. And that was the approach of the benefit fraud assessments.